The Slave Who Could Wake the Master's Daughter, an unforgettable story. The story begins in the American South during the first half of the 19th century, in a region where land meant power and silence was enforced by fear. The plantation stood wide and imposing, its white columns rising above fields worked by enslaved men and women whose lives were measured in sunrises and exhaustion. From the outside, the house symbolized control, tradition, and permanence. Inside, it hid fragility. On a winter morning marked by frost and stillness, the master's household was shaken by an event no one could command. His daughter, a woman of 23 years, educated, articulate, and considered the future of the family name, did not awaken. At first, no one panicked. Illness was common, and rest was assumed to be enough. But hours passed, and her eyes remained closed. Her breathing grew uneven, shallow enough to alarm the servants assigned to her care. By evening, the master was summoned from his office, and by nightfall, candles burned continuously at her bedside. Doctors were sent for immediately. They arrived with leather bags and practiced confidence, but their certainty dissolved as they examined her. There were no clear signs of fever, no visible injury, no explanation that fit neatly into their knowledge. They prescribed bleeding, tonics, cold compresses, and prayers. Nothing changed. The plantation's rhythm shifted. Work continued in the fields, but whispers traveled faster than orders. Enslaved workers spoke quietly of omens and warnings of balance disturbed. Power, they understood, was never as stable as it appeared. When the master's voice cracked while giving instructions, it confirmed what everyone already felt. Something essential was breaking. The master had built his life on command. He believed the world responded to force, to rules written and enforced by men like him. Yet standing in his daughter's room, watching her unmoving face, he confronted a reality beyond his reach. He had lost his wife years earlier, and this daughter was not only family but legacy. Without her, the future he imagined collapsed into uncertainty. Each passing hour deepened his desperation. Days followed nights with no improvement. More doctors came, some from neighboring towns, others from distant cities. Their conclusions contradicted one another, but none offered hope. One suggested her condition might be permanent. Another warned she might not survive the week. The master paid them all, dismissed them all, and remained alone with his fear. The house that once echoed with footsteps and conversation now moved cautiously, as though sound itself might worsen her condition. Among those who watched from the margins was a boy named Elijah. He was 16, small for his age, and owned by the plantation since birth. His tasks were menial and constant, carrying water, cleaning floors, delivering messages. He had learned early that invisibility was survival. People spoke freely around those they did not consider human in the same way. Elijah listened without appearing to listen. He learned without being taught. His mother had been brought to the plantation years before from another state. She was known among the enslaved community for her quiet wisdom. She spoke of breath and focus, of the way the body could trap the mind, and how the voice could sometimes call it back. She had tended to the sick when no doctor would come. She died when Elijah was 12, leaving behind memories rather than instructions. Yet memory, passed carefully, can become knowledge. Elijah had been near the master's daughter often enough to observe her habits. She was not cruel, but distance separated them. She read books, practiced music, and spoke of places Elijah would never see. On the day she collapsed, Elijah had been carrying water past the doorway. He had seen her stagger, heard the sharp intake of breath before servants caught her. That moment stayed with him. Something about it did not feel like illness. It felt like absence. As the third night arrived, tension in the house became unbearable. The master sat beside the bed, staring as though his will alone might force movement. Servants stood along the walls, waiting for instructions that never came. Elijah was there to refill lamps. His hands trembled as he worked, not from fear of punishment, but from certainty forming inside him. He believed he understood what had happened, and more dangerously, he believed he might be able to help. He said nothing at first. Speaking without permission could cost him his life. But as hours passed and the master's despair deepened, Elijah felt the weight of silence pressing on him. He remembered his mother's words, spoken late at night, about moments when risk becomes responsibility. When no one else can act, someone must. Near dawn, when exhaustion had dulled everyone's reactions, Elijah spoke. His voice was low, steady, almost respectful. He said he thought he could wake her. The words landed heavily, as if the air itself resisted them. Heads turned. A doctor scoffed. A servant gasped. The master stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. Rage rose quickly, fueled by grief and disbelief. A slave child daring to claim power over life and death was not just offensive. It was dangerous. The master demanded an explanation. Elijah did not offer one. He only repeated that he believed he could help. Guards moved closer. Punishment was expected. Yet before an order could be given, something shifted. The master looked again at his daughter's face, unchanged, unreachable. His anger faltered, replaced by the unbearable weight of helplessness. Pride battled fear, and fear began to win. He dismissed everyone from the room except a single guard and Elijah. The decision shocked the household. Allowing a slave near his daughter in such a moment defied every rule he lived by. But desperation rewrites rules quickly. The master warned Elijah that failure would not be forgiven. The boy accepted without hesitation. He had already measured the cost. Elijah approached the bed slowly. He did not touch her. Instead, he stood close enough for his voice to carry. He focused on his breathing, steadying himself as his mother had taught him. He began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but with rhythm and intention. Words meant to anchor, to remind, to invite return. At first, nothing happened. The guard watched carefully. The master clenched his fists, bracing for disappointment. Minutes passed. Sweat formed on Elijah's brow. His voice wavered, then steadied again. The room felt charged, as though something unseen hovered just beyond reach. Then, almost imperceptibly, the master's daughter's breathing changed. It deepened, slowed. Elijah's knees weakened, but he continued. Suddenly, his strength failed him. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious, his body unable to hold the effort any longer. The guard moved forward, convinced it had all been foolish hope. The master turned away, defeated once more. And then, from the bed behind him, came a sound no one expected. A sharp breath, a faint movement, the kind of movement that cannot be explained away. The master froze, torn between disbelief and terror, as his daughter's fingers twitched for the first time since she had fallen, leaving everyone in the room suspended on the edge of a moment that would change everything. The room remained frozen in disbelief as the smallest movement rippled through it. At first, no one dared to speak. The master stood with his back half-turned, afraid that if he looked directly, the moment would vanish. The guard leaned closer to the bed, eyes fixed on the woman's hand, as if expecting it to still itself again. Then her chest rose with a fuller breath, deeper than any taken in days. It was unmistakable. Life was returning. The master turned slowly. His daughter's eyelids fluttered, not fully open, but no longer sealed shut. A sound escaped her lips, faint and unformed, yet powerful enough to break the silence that had ruled the house. In that instant, the rules governing the plantation felt suddenly fragile. The man who commanded hundreds could not command this moment, and the boy lying unconscious on the floor had done what money, authority, and science could not. Doctors were summoned back in haste. They examined her again, confused by the change they could not explain. Some spoke of delayed recovery, others of coincidence. None could deny what they saw. The master ordered the boy carried to a nearby room, not out of kindness, but necessity. Elijah's breathing was shallow, his face pale. The effort had taken more from him than anyone understood. By morning, the daughter's eyes opened fully. She did not rise, but she was present. She looked around the room with confusion, then fear, then recognition. Her father knelt beside her, overcome in a way no one had ever witnessed. His voice broke as he spoke her name. She answered weakly, grounding him in reality once more. When asked what she remembered, she described darkness, not frightening but heavy, and a voice that cut through it. A steady voice that refused to let her drift away. She did not know whose it was, only that it spoke with certainty, as if it knew she could hear. When Elijah was brought into the room later that day, supported by two servants, her eyes fixed on him. Something passed between them that required no explanation. The house buzzed with unease. Word spread beyond its walls, carried by whispers and glances. A slave boy had done the impossible. For some, it was a miracle. For others, it was a threat. Power depends on predictability, and Elijah had disrupted it. Neighboring plantation owners began to ask questions. Not all were friendly. The master found himself trapped between gratitude and fear. He owed his daughter's life to a boy he legally owned. To acknowledge that debt openly risked undermining the authority he had built his life upon. Yet denying it felt impossible. He avoided Elijah at first, postponing decisions, hoping the moment would fade. It did not. Elijah recovered slowly. He spoke little, aware that attention could be dangerous. Other enslaved people watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. His act had given hope, but hope could be punished. Guards were instructed to keep a close watch. Protection and imprisonment blurred into the same thing. The daughter insisted on seeing him again. She asked questions no one had ever asked a slave before. Where had he learned such things? Why had he spoken when silence would have been safer? Elijah answered honestly. He spoke of his mother, of lessons given quietly, of a belief that some knowledge was meant to be used, regardless of cost. She listened, changed by the understanding that intelligence and humanity had been deliberately ignored all around her. Pressure mounted from outside. Some demanded Elijah be sold, removed before his influence spread. Others suggested punishment, framing his actions as arrogance rather than service. The master delayed, torn between the world he knew and the debt he could no longer deny. At night, he replayed the moment he had nearly ordered the boy beaten for speaking. He wondered how close he had come to burying his daughter. The decision came quietly. One morning, the master gathered his household. Elijah was brought forward. No chains were placed on him. The master's voice carried uncertainty as he spoke, but also resolve. He declared Elijah free. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Freedom was not contagious, but the idea of it was. The daughter stood beside her father, steady now, fully awake. She looked at Elijah not as a savior, not as property, but as a man who had chosen courage when the world offered him none. Elijah did not smile. Freedom felt unreal, fragile, like something that could still be taken away. As the plantation returned to its routines, nothing was truly the same. A single act had exposed the lie beneath the system, that worth could be owned, controlled, or silenced forever. Elijah walked away from the house that had defined his life, uncertain of what awaited him, carrying knowledge passed through generations that history had tried to erase. The camera lingers on the empty doorway, the place where he once stood unseen. The narrator's voice lowers, reminding us that this story is not about one miracle, but about the countless moments when truth nearly spoke and was forced back into silence. What followed Elijah's freedom would ripple far beyond that plantation, into a nation struggling to reckon with the humanity it had denied and the cost of ignoring voices that were never meant to disappear. Elijah's departure did not bring peace. Freedom, in a land built on bondage, rarely arrived without consequences. The moment he stepped beyond the gates of the plantation, eyes followed him from every direction. Some belonged to enslaved people who watched with quiet wonder, others to overseers who measured his walk for signs of defiance. He carried no belongings, only the weight of what he had done. In saving the master's daughter, he had crossed an invisible line, and lines like that were remembered. Inside the house, the master faced a reckoning of his own. Word of his decision spread quickly across neighboring estates. Some men arrived under the pretense of concern, offering congratulations for his daughter's recovery. Others came with sharper intentions, questioning his judgment warning him of dangerous precedent. A slave freed not for years of labor or payment, but for knowledge and courage, unsettled the order they depended on. They spoke of unrest, of ideas spreading faster than chains could stop them. The master listened, outwardly calm, inwardly shaken. He had always believed himself a practical man, yet now he confronted the truth that practicality had nearly cost him everything. At night, he replayed the moment Elijah's voice broke the silence in his daughter's room. He imagined the alternative ending, the one in which pride had silenced that voice forever. That thought followed him like a shadow. The daughter recovered steadily. Strength returned to her limbs, clarity to her thoughts. But she was no longer the same woman who had collapsed days earlier. She asked questions that made servants pause. She noticed the bruises on wrists, the exhaustion in faces she had once passed without seeing. What had happened to her had pulled back a veil. She understood now that survival and suffering existed side by side, deliberately kept apart. She insisted that her father listen, not in anger, but in quiet persistence. She spoke of Elijah, of his mother, of knowledge deliberately denied. Each conversation unsettled him more than any accusation could. He had ruled through certainty, and certainty was slipping away. Elijah, meanwhile, moved carefully through a world that had never been meant to receive him as an equal. Freedom papers offered legal protection, but not safety. Some towns welcomed him cautiously, curious about the story they had heard in fragments. Others turned him away, unwilling to face what his existence represented. He slept where he could, worked where he was allowed, and spoke only when necessary. Attention was a risk he could not afford. Yet stories traveled whether he wished them to or not. Enslaved communities whispered his name with a mix of hope and warning. He became proof that knowledge survived even where it was forbidden, that humanity could not be completely erased. That idea frightened those in power far more than any act of rebellion. She pressed her father again, this time with questions he could not dismiss. What would happen to the others? Could one act of mercy exist alongside daily cruelty? He had no answers. He found himself caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Authority no longer felt natural. It felt heavy, compromised. News of Elijah's abilities reached places he had never seen. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others saw opportunity. In a society obsessed with control, the idea of a man who could influence life without permission was unsettling. A few began to search for him, not to learn from him, but to contain him. Elijah sensed the shift before he saw it. Strangers lingered too long. Questions became sharper. Kindness felt transactional. One evening, as he prepared to leave yet another town, he was approached by an older man who spoke carefully, choosing his words with intention. He warned Elijah that his name had reached the wrong ears, that men with resources were asking where he had gone. Elijah thanked him and left before dawn. Fear was no longer abstract. It had direction. The documentary slows here, allowing the weight of inevitability to settle. History teaches us that systems do not forgive disruption easily. Those who expose cracks often become targets, not because they are violent, but because they are undeniable. Elijah carried proof that intelligence and dignity had survived in places designed to erase both. That proof threatened more than loss. It threatened belief. As he moved farther from the plantation, Elijah grappled with doubt. He questioned whether speaking that night had saved a life only to endanger many others. Yet when he remembered the moment her breathing changed, the moment darkness gave way, he knew he would choose the same again. Some acts define a life so completely that regret becomes impossible. The camera returns briefly to the plantation, now quieter, more guarded. The master stands alone on the porch, watching the fields. He understands now that control maintained through denial is fragile. His daughter stands beside him, steady, observant, aware that her survival has bound her to a truth she cannot unlearn. Neither speaks. Words feel insufficient. The narration tightens, drawing attention to the narrowing path ahead. Elijah walks on, unaware of how close pursuit has come, aware only that standing still is no longer an option. The road stretches forward, uncertain and unforgiving. Behind him, the past refuses to release its grip. Ahead, a reckoning waits, shaped by fear, power, and a voice that once dared to speak. The tension holds on that road, on that movement, on the knowledge that the next encounter will not be accidental. What Elijah awakened in one room has begun to stir something far larger, and the forces determined to put it back to sleep are already closing in. The search for Elijah did not announce itself with warrants or declarations. It moved quietly, carried by conversations in back rooms and letters sealed with familiar names. Men who had never cared about the inner lives of enslaved people now spoke intensely about order, stability, and precedent. They framed their concern as practical, even reasonable. A man like Elijah, they said, could inspire ideas that were difficult to control. Ideas, unlike bodies, did not remain where they were placed. Elijah felt the pressure long before he understood its source. Paths that once seemed open closed without explanation. Work disappeared. Faces hardened. Even those who wished him well grew distant, afraid of being associated with him. He learned to read the smallest signals. A glance held too long, a greeting withheld, a sudden silence when he entered a room. Freedom had taught him a new kind of vigilance. One evening, outside a small town, he noticed he was no longer alone on the road. Footsteps echoed behind him at a measured distance. He did not turn. He changed his pace, then his direction. The footsteps followed. When he finally looked back, the figure had vanished, but the message was clear. He was being watched. The documentary pauses here to widen its lens. This was not unusual. Throughout American history, moments of moral disruption were often followed by quiet efforts to restore balance. Not justice, but balance. Elijah's act had disrupted a narrative carefully maintained, that those in chains were incapable of agency beyond labor. His existence now contradicted that story, and contradictions demand resolution. At the plantation, the daughter pressed further into territory her father avoided. She requested that families not be separated during sales. She asked that punishments be reduced. Each request, modest on its own, carried weight. The master resisted at first, then relented in small ways. He told himself these were temporary concessions, necessary to restore peace. But peace did not return. Awareness had taken its place. He began to notice things he had trained himself not to see. The slowness of movement after long days, the quiet endurance, the intelligence expressed only when no authority was present. The system he had inherited now appeared less like tradition and more like machinery, grinding forward because no one had ever stopped it. Meanwhile, Elijah reached a crossroads both literal and symbolic. He could continue running, surviving quietly until his name faded. Or he could seek out those who might understand his knowledge, people who valued learning over control. Both choices carried risk. One promised invisibility. The other promised exposure. He chose movement toward meaning. He followed rumors of free black communities forming farther north, places where education, though limited, existed. Each mile carried him closer to hope and danger in equal measure. He traveled mostly at night, guided by stars and borrowed directions. Sleep came lightly. Dreams were filled with voices calling him back, just as he had once called another from darkness. The tension tightens as the camera returns to the men searching for him. Their efforts grow more focused. Descriptions sharpen. Rewards are discussed. What began as discomfort has become determination. They do not speak of punishment openly, only of containment, of preventing disruption. Language softens intent, but intent remains. Elijah does not yet know how close they are. He knows only that the road feels heavier, the air more watchful. Each step forward carries the possibility of capture or connection. The narrator's voice lowers, reminding us that history often turns on moments when an individual must decide whether survival is enough or whether truth demands more. As Elijah disappears into the tree line at dawn, The screen fades slowly, holding on the quiet before the storm. The pursuit has begun in earnest, and the next choice he makes will determine not only his fate, but how far the echo of that single night on the plantation will carry. Elijah reached the outskirts of a larger town just as daylight spread across the road. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of carts and voices filled the air. Places like this offered both opportunity and danger. Crowds made it easier to disappear, but they also multiplied the number of eyes that could recognize him. He moved carefully, keeping his head down, listening more than he spoke. Freedom had sharpened his awareness. Every decision now carried consequences he alone would bear. He found temporary work unloading supplies near the river. The labor was hard but familiar, and for a short while, routine quieted his fear. Yet even there, he sensed tension. Men watched him too closely. Questions came indirectly, disguised as curiosity about where he was from and why he traveled alone. Elijah answered cautiously, knowing that a wrong detail could unravel everything. That evening, as he prepared to leave the town, two men approached him openly. They spoke politely, almost warmly, claiming to have heard of his skills. They suggested he could earn steady money if he came with them to help a sick relative. The offer sounded practiced. Elijah declined, citing other obligations. The men exchanged a glance that confirmed what he already knew. This was no coincidence. He left before night, fully settled, cutting through narrow paths beyond the main road. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from certainty. The search had narrowed. He was no longer a rumor. He was a target. The documentary pulls back again, reminding us that this pattern repeats across time. When systems feel threatened, they rarely respond with force at first. They test boundaries, apply pressure, and wait for fear to do the work. Elijah was being asked, without words, to return to silence. At the plantation, tension reached a breaking point of a different kind. The master's peers pressed harder, questioning his judgment openly now. Some warned that his daughter's influence was becoming dangerous. Others hinted that authorities might intervene if order was not restored. The master stood firm outwardly, but privately he wavered. His world was shrinking, caught between loyalty to his child and allegiance to a system that had shaped him. The daughter sensed the shift. She understood that her survival had given her a voice, but that voice came with risk. She began writing letters, carefully worded, reaching out to distant relatives and acquaintances known for quieter reformist ideas. She did not call for revolution. She called for reflection. Even that felt radical. Elijah traveled through the night, exhaustion pressing in. Near dawn, he reached a small settlement rumored to shelter free black families. The buildings were modest, the welcome cautious but sincere. For the first time since leaving the plantation, he felt a fragile sense of belonging. He shared his story only in fragments, enough to explain his need to stay hidden. But safety, once tasted, can invite complacency. Within days, unfamiliar faces appeared near the settlement. Conversations stopped when Elijah entered rooms. Someone had spoken. Whether out of fear or necessity did not matter. The result was the same. The walls were closing in again. The narrator's voice tightens, carrying a warning shaped by history. There are moments when survival demands not only movement but decision. Elijah stands at such a moment now. He can disappear further, abandoning connection for safety, or he can confront the forces pursuing him, risking everything to protect what he represents. As night falls, he packs quietly, aware that dawn may bring confrontation. In the distance, lantern light flickers on the road leading into the settlement. Footsteps approach, deliberate and unhurried. The screen fades as Elijah pauses at the doorway, caught between flight and resolve, knowing that the next choice he makes will define whether his story becomes a whispered legend or a silenced warning.